this in the past several years, and it's gonna only get worse with heavy rainfall at some points and droughts at other points. Yeah, we can hit the next slide. So organic farming systems have been shown to be effective both in adapting to climate change and being more resilient to temperature and precipitation extremes. No-till farming systems can go even further in increasing soil health. So the idea with working with soil health to mitigate climate change impacts is that the organic matter in the soil acts as a sponge. So when it's dry, it kind of holds moisture and releases it, and it's going to absorb moisture better when it's wet, when we have these extreme wet events. There's also a surface residue that can protect the soil surface. We've definitely seen some major erosion events during the heavy storms, in spite of the fact that we're doing all the best management practices to reduce erosion. Also, in theory, reduced tillage means fewer weeds, because the turning up of the soil, the tillage is what gets a lot of, especially annual weeds. It's the trigger that causes them to germinate. So in theory, if you don't till the soil, you're going to have a lower weed pressure. The trick is that, our cropping systems are all based on cultivation for weed control. So really, in some ways, we're completely reinventing our cropping systems when we're going to no-till or reduced tillage. Next slide, please. So we have two different no-till systems that we've started using. One of which we started in 2020. So we've got 2 seasons, and we played around with it a little bit before this, but we've got 2 seasons of really doing it. It's an intensive system where we put down compost as a mulch, and then we use tarps for weed control. And this is kind of, so I guess I didn't say what our scale is. We grow about 10 acres of vegetables, and we manage about 50 acres of land total. So a lot of the rest of it is in cover crops or pasture, or either pasture that's in rotation with the cropland or pasture that's permanent pasture. So our idea with this intensive system is that some of the crops that we can fit into this, into a smaller intensive system, we're kind of shrinking the production into a smaller acreage for those crops. So, and we're really kind of following the lead of a lot of small market garden, 1 to 5 acre market garden systems, and just trying to really shrink our production, but still get the same amount of crop out of it. The other system is an extensive system with a transferred mulch. So we cut cover crop in one place, and then in the place where we're going to crop, and then we cut more cover crop and put it on top for a extra heavy mulch. So this is based on ideas out of Germany from a agronomist named Jan Hendrik Kropp. And this is a new system that we started in 2021. Got a bunch of equipment that you'll see from a acre grant from Mass Department of Agriculture. You can do the next slide, please. So this is a picture of the more intensive system. So in this system, our beds are 300 feet. This is a picture from 2020. We spread compost, with tractors, and then in the spring, and then from there, this area was completely, no tractors even went in there, and we divided it into actually 100-foot sections. There were 300-foot long sections, and you can see we just moved the tarp around. We would plant the salad. It was mostly salad greens, radishes. We did do some carrots in this type of system, but we're seeding right into that mulch. Actually, we're putting the compost down. We're putting a tarp down, suppress weeds, to suppress weed germination. And then we plant into that mulch, into that compost, harvest for a while. When we're done harvesting, we put the tarp back on to kill the crop, and then come back in and seed directly into that killed crop. So you can see that there's some residue there, and we're just planting right into it. This section in 2020, we went 3 cycles through. So we planted, tarped, planted, tarped, planted, tarped. And we're also, we had typically done 5 rows per bed in our cultivation system. So we had to cultivate in between the rows. So with the tractors and that, we needed some space for the cultivation equipment to get in there. But we went 10 rows per bed with this system. And so we're essentially doing the same production on 1/6 of the cropland. So we like this. In 2021, we did it on a higher acreage. We hit the next slide, please. This is a little diagram that kind of shows how we did it in 2020, where I was talking about how we divided the field into thirds. So we would have planted in 1, while there's a tarp on 2, and then the tarp comes off 2, and we plant in 2. We leave the tarp on for 3 weeks usually, but in the summer we were able to get away sometimes with just 2 weeks. So by the time we're seeding in 6, we've done harvested. We're probably done harvesting in 1, 2, and 3, and we've got the tarp back on there. So we just kind of rotate around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In 2021, so one of the disadvantages here was, we couldn't get, if we've got crops in 1 and 2 and 5 and 6, we can't really get into 3 and 4 with the tractor, which we didn't really do much, but we ended up deciding to go to a system where we do 1 full long bed. So this has to be, the tarps are 100 feet long. This has to be 3 tarps that we have in section 1, and then another full long section in number 2. And then we're actually moving to the 3, 4, 5, and 6 or somewhere else. So we're doing it on more acreage and kind of doing it in more regular chunks. One of the things we found in 2020 was we're doing, a lot of arugula, salad greens, a lot of stuff in the mustard family. The flea beetle pressure was fierce, where we're all staying in the same spot and they can really build up their population. You can see we did use remay. We were able to get crops out with that level of remay protection on the mustard greens. But if you forgot to put that tarp back on after you harvested it, that was the end of it. I guess some of the other issues we had with this that we're still working out, you can see that amount of crop residue there. We're seeding with that Jang seeder that you see. My tendency is kind of just be stubborn and bolt through things. So I would often just push that seeder through that residue, and you get residue kind of building up in the front. We figured out that if we rake the residue off first, that worked a little better. But in general, we sometimes have problems with the Jang seeder with getting an even stand. It works a lot of the time, but not every single time. Yeah, I think we can hit the next slide. So we had pretty good luck with weed control in this system. The compost that we had was relatively low weed pressure. You can see, we've got that weed control is pretty good. There are some weeds in there. It's less weeds, and this is after no hand weeding or anything. We did find that we do want to sometimes go and wire hoe when the seedlings are still real small, but it's such a quick rotation that, I don't know, this section right above largely, you can see there's some weeds there. We've got pretty much a full crop there, and those weeds aren't going to go to seed before we tarp it again. So it worked out pretty well, even where there was some little gaps. In 2021, we did start to see that there was some perennial grass weeds that were coming in. So that cycle of just the real quick crop, tarp, wasn't really enough time tarping, I think, to kill the perennial grasses. So we're working on, as we develop the system, we're going to be in this intensive system and then go out of it, and try and rotate between the more intensive and the more extensive systems so that we get some time with deeper rooted cover crops. Also partly to break the soil hard pan up and just get, I think the soil health is not helped out as much by these short cycles. The plants don't have time to establish and really feed the soil biology. Next slide, please. There's another picture of that. It's a different spot from 2020 with our, this is lettuce that was transplanted directly into the compost mulch. And again, like, that weed control is not perfect, but this is with no weed control at all. No hoeing or anything. So that's pretty good weed control. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And it, in our cultivated system, we would be unlikely to see weed control that good either. Hit the next slide. This is what we used to transplant into that system. This is actually based on a SARE grant that we saw. We bolted some extra spikes to the wheels, to the spikes of our water wheel transplanter. This is just a standard Knowles produce brand transplanter. And those spikes are able to kind of punch through the mulch and get down into the soil. And this worked out pretty well. In 2021, we actually added extra wheels to this. So again, with not cultivating, we've got more space. All right, we don't need to have kind of dead space where the cultivator is going to go through. So now we're going with a 5-row system instead of a 3-row system for the 6-foot bed. So again, we're planting more per acre, and this is part of the way that we're able to afford, like, all that compost is it's a lot of material to apply. But if we're concentrating that into a smaller area, then we can afford to do this kind of thing. The tarps are also, it's a lot of effort to move tarps around. So again, if we get more out of every place that we're putting a tarp and then picking it up, then we're able to make it work better. Yeah, hit the next slide. So that was the intensive system. This is the more extensive system, which again was new this last season. You'll see the equipment, I think, next after this, but we're basically, that's me, and that's Dave, my farming partner. We're going and we're mowing a cover crop. In most cases this year it was rye, and then we're going to mow more cover crop or pasture somewhere else and spread that mulch onto those beds, and then that spiky transplanter goes and kind of plants directly in. It's a little hard to see, but in the picture on the right, there's pepper plants that have been planted in there where the rows of drip tape are. Gonna hit the next slide. So, Anna, this is where, yeah, time for the video. There's a video that Anna's gonna load up here. That's a video that was taken during a field day that we did through NOFA. So you'll see the equipment that we used. Here we go. So this is our collection flail mower. See, it's got like a big hopper in the back, and it's called the kangaroo, because it's a kangaroo because it pops up. It's got a hydraulic thing that kind of pops up and dumps the mulch into the manure spreader. This machine is so cool. We were so excited when we got it. You can drive really fast to harvesting that mulch. It's a pretty quick process. So and then the mulch is spread with the manure spreader. So, there's definitely some issues with trying to get that mulch evenly through the manure spreader, and a lot of that was about kind of dumping it right with the flail mower. And then here you can see that we're not actually planting anything. This is just a demo, but you can see that spiky transplanter going into the directly into the mulch. So yeah, back to the slideshow. So thank you, Anna, for being my tech support person. In the chat, there's a question: what's the name of the transplanter? It's a Knowles Produce brand transplanter. But there's, you could do this with any water wheel transplanter. So we had plenty of issues with this system. It was a real learning curve. Getting the system together. One of the things that we had trouble with that we figured out how to do it better. That transplanter, the spike kind of makes a hole, and it's going to push the mulch down in there as well. And the hole that it makes, the soil is different than a tilled soil. In a tilled soil, when you go through with the water wheel transplanter, it makes kind of like a muddy hole, and you're putting sorry, I'm just going to keep talking while the slides get figured out. If anyone's distracted, I don't know, maybe you can tell me to stop talking, but I'm going to keep talking. So the water wheel transplanter in a tilled soil, it kind of makes this muddy hole, and you put the plant in, and then as that water dries, it kind of forms around the plant, and you've got good soil contact. With the with the tilled or the no-till soil, it's really more like a hole, and it's got mulch in it, and it's got water in it. Go that way. And when the water dries up, the water just kind of goes away, and you still have a hole there. So you really have to kind of pull the mulch out, and then put the plant in, and then squeeze the soil around the plant a little bit. So it ended up, we had our first few times that we used it in this heavily mulched soil, we did have some crops that we lost just because we put the plant in and it was hot and dry. It was the wettest July on record, but in May and June when we were planting, it was really dry and hot. So that we did have some cucumber plants that we lost, and some tomato plants after we planted them. And we figured out, and onions as well, we figured out that just taking the extra time to clear that hole out and then push the soil really improved our stand. We're actually looking at this coming season we'll have to modify the whole frame of the transplanter, but putting it's called a coulter in front of the transplanter. That's something that'll cut like a little slot through the mulch, and it disturbs the soil just a little bit, so that hopefully that the transplanter spike will go in there a little better. We also saw some issues with nitrogen tie-up. We're pretty sure that's what it was. We just had plants that even when they were well set in there, they just weren't thriving. And we went through kind of a little troubleshooting process, and it seemed like when we put a little bit of nitrogen down in the drip tape, that helped. It could have also been some allelopathy from the rye, but we're pretty sure it was mostly nitrogen. So essentially, like, we're mowing rye that's been growing. The rye is really good at sucking all the nitrogen up out of the soil. And so the nitrogen is in that rye cover crop. We're going to mow the rye. We're going to put down more cover crop on top of that. So there's a lot of nitrogen in that plant material, but there's not much in the soil underneath. And eventually the nitrogen in the plant material is going to become available to the plant, but we think we need to just give it a little bit of starter nitrogen. We're still figuring out how to do that. It could be in the transplanter water. It could be that we kind of broadcast that before we mow. We're also looking at not doing as much rye, which has also relates to our third point, is that timing of mowing that cover crop was difficult. So rye, you can mow it and kill it when it's flowering at a certain stage of flowering, which happens in kind of mid to late June. And we're doing a lot of planting in May and early June. So for those earlier seasons, we need either an oat pea cover crop that gets winter killed. Actually, we're doing a lot of that. Or we can mow the rye early and put a tarp down to make sure that we kill it. So we're working on that. I think this whole thing, one of the things that we're really haven't quite gotten to yet, but the system and the sequence of when, which crop comes after which, and things like I was saying with the intensive system, we want to rotate into the intensive system and then out of it. That sequencing we haven't really quite figured out. We're working on kind of the individual components of our rotation in our system, and I'd say maybe by next year or maybe by the end of this season we'll have a little bit better idea of how to kind of sequence things so that there is always the right number of oat and pea blocks that are going to go into earlier planted things versus rye that'll go later. So that's something that we're still working on. To do the next slide. So this is Caro's part of the presentation that I don't really know as much about, but this was, she did a whole bunch of tracking of soil health, which was much appreciated. And really in some ways we're kind of starting a baseline of how the soil health improves as we go into this no-till system. So I'm very interested in this. One of the things that Caro has found working with other no-till growers is just anecdotally, she says that people say that it takes 4 years to get your your no-till soil into that that chocolate cake soil that everybody is really wants. So we have a situation here where we're going through that transition and we can actually document it. So most of these soil tests that she did, really there's not a real conclusion so much as this is like the baseline, what things look like. And she did some, we're not 100% no-till yet. So she was able to do some no-till sections and some till sections, and including in kind of, we got 2 soil types on the farm. We're all very, very sandy, but we've got one place where it's a fine sandy loam and another place where it's a loamy sand. So sandy, but yeah, it'll be good to do that. So yeah, so these are some of the, you can actually hit that next slide, Anna. These are some of the things she was looking at. Yeah, the soil hardness over time and the compaction. Compaction is one of the issues that people tend to see at the beginning part of their no-till transition. And hopefully we'll get some more information about whether we're gaining organic matter. We actually applied for a SARE grant for next year, looking at the timing of nitrogen release. So that question of the nitrogen, if we get this grant, we're gonna be taking, it's called a PSNT, pre-side dress nitrogen test, that just measures how much nitrogen is available in the soil. And we'll take those repeatedly through the season so it'll help us track a little better how that nitrogen becomes available. Okay, the next slide. So these are some other resources if you want to read more about no-till. The first one is the Organic Farming Research Foundation, who's near to my heart. I've just gotten off their board. They've got actually a whole series of reports on soil health, including one that talks about practices that for climate mitigation, adaptation, and carbon sequestration. There's a video presentation. This is the only source of English language information on that transferred mulch system that Jan Hendrik Kropp developed. And then there's also there's some information from the field day that we had last May that you saw a video for, but I believe there's also a video that includes Dave and I talking about all the stuff that we were doing. And it was current to last May. So yeah, that's what I've got for presentation. I intentionally left some space for people to ask questions. So happy to take any questions now.
This was great. Thank you, Jeremy. So again, you can actually go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a direct question. I know that Terry had a question about the, are you always using green mulch or wood as well?
It's always green mulch. Yeah. We don't have a source of wood chips, enough wood chips to spread those. And I think that would also have a pretty heavy nitrogen tie-up issue with that. Maybe not till the second year, but that would be it'd be a lot of mulch, a lot of wood chips to spread. I see someone's asking about the horsepower of the tractor. Our tractor is it's a John Deere, a 5085. So I believe that's like an 80 horsepower tractor, 80, 85.
Jerry, you have I'm sorry, go ahead.
The manure spreader we put that on a smaller tractor. It's a 5055, which is about a 50 horsepower tractor. And
so Jerry, you have your hand up. Sorry, Jeremy, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, that's okay.
No, thank you. Great presentation, Jeremy. Wondering, this is your second year. Are you able to grow the same crops with no-till that you did with your conventional growing system, or maybe better put, which ones can you grow root crops as well as non-root crops, etc.? Maybe just a little 101 on what's been doing better or not. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of the crops that we are not doing no-till because we haven't quite figured out how to do it, and maybe we won't, but potatoes, strawberries, leeks, sweet potatoes. We did grow carrots in the compost mulch intensive system. We found, well, there's two things. One is we dig carrots with an undercutter bar on the tractor. So you're really disturbing the soil. So with those, that is intensive beds, we're putting down a layer of compost, trying to create beds and really leave them without disturbing them. So when we go through and pull carrots or dig carrots with that digger bar, we think we're kind of like resetting everything. And that might be part of our sequencing in the future. Like, you do your salad greens one year, the next year you do carrots once, and then you put it into cover crop and go into the extensive system. The other thing we found with carrots, and this may be something that's temporary until we kind of work our way into better soil structure and work our way out of compaction issues that may or may not be like first year transition issues, is that sometimes we would get, fat carrots that were, short little fat carrots that just grew in that little compost layer, and then they hit a compaction layer and couldn't go any further. And actually we planted some carrots this fall that we overwinter, where we went through with a subsoiler, and then we actually we've done this now in a few places where we had pasture that we killed the pasture by tarping it, which wasn't something that was actually one of the places that we thought we were going to need to use tillage is when we're coming out of pasture. Well, you got to plow, but we've actually been able to tarp and kill pasture. So the section where we planted carrots, we tarped it, killed the pasture, and then we went through with a subsoiler to kind of, it disturbed the soil, but it doesn't really change the soil profile, and goes and cuts a track down into the subsoil, breaks up the compaction, and then we put the compost down. And then I think we tarped it again, and then we planted carrots in it. So we'll see how that works out. We're hoping that has like bigger, longer carrots.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Jeremy, I have another question here from the
Someone
chat.
asked about how many acres mowing to cover how many acres in crops. It was about 3 to 4 acres mowed. And this is actually one of the things that Jan Hendrik Krop goes over is he's doing, so it was 3 or 4 acres of the May and June growth of cover crop and pasture. So he actually mows mulch during the summer and stockpiles it and actually makes it into silage, and then spreads that. So he's got a stockpile that he can spread in the spring, and he's able to do just a 1-to-1. So he's got 1 acre of mulch growing for every 1 acre that he's planting in mulch. So that's something that we may try and do some silage for storage this coming season. But that we're not at that point yet. We actually also tried doing, I think in maybe just one spot, we mowed some mulch and then put that down. And then we got, as part of the same acre grant, we also got a no-till grain drill. So we put the mulch down and then seeded cover crop directly into that mulch. So we're essentially stockpiling that mulch in place rather than trying to ensile it and then put it on the fields.
Jeremy,
question.
can I jump 1 second?
Yep.
I should have said this at the beginning, but for you and anybody else who's asking questions, it's super helpful if you use a particular sort of farming jargon, the name of a particular tool from an interpretation point of view, if you could just pause for a second.
Okay.
Sometimes
sure.
those things are hard to translate and it might take the interpreter a moment to kind of think it through.
Yep.
So it's hard to remember that all the time, but I just want to put that out there for folks to keep in mind. Great.
There
Thank
was
you.
a question in the chat. Do you have any advice for tractorless farms? And I would say that that first intensive system that I showed is really kind of modeled on systems that are designed for a more, a smaller scale tractorless farm. And there's a lot of information out there. A lot of the work that's being done in organic no-till is in these small scale market gardens. So we're kind of trying to adapt those systems to our larger scale. And essentially we're kind of shrinking our scale to fit, to fit that type of system for those particular crops. So that's a short answer. There's a lot more there, but there's also a lot of information out there. And then just a quick, someone was asking about the carrots. The carrots are overwintering out there. We plant them in November and then put remay, and we have this giant sheet of greenhouse plastic that we put over them, hoops, and then remay, and then a giant sheet of greenhouse plastic. And we usually have carrots in early May out of that system. And we've usually done it in a tillage system. This year we're trying it no-till.
Awesome. Jeremy, Mark actually has his hand up, has a question for you.
Okay.
Hi, so you talked about transplanting into your the rye cover crop. So that would be like probably a later season planting. And I think you might have mentioned wanting to try it, but did you get a chance to do that planting system into an oat pea cover crop for early spring planting?
Yeah, and actually what we'll be doing for oats and peas, I'm trying to think if we actually did it. I don't think we actually did it this past year. And so actually we were planting some of the earlier crops into rye that had been mowed, but that hadn't been killed.
Mhm.
So that was one of the things that didn't go so great. But we were actually able to just put weed mat down in between the rows, and that worked out okay.
Yeah.
So we did have one of the other things you can do for an early crop is we get a bunch of leaves that get dumped on the farm by landscapers, and we did spread some leaves over the top of a oat pea cover crop and planted directly into the leaf mulch, and that worked out well. We did that with onions and like barely any hand weeding at all.
Great. The other question I had was, have you tried direct seeding into that extensive mulch system? Or do you have any ideas of how you might do that?
No, we haven't. And the idea of how to do it is that you need like a big heavy duty no-till planter. So, something like a big sweet corn grower might go no-till and be able to plant, acres and acres of sweet corn with their specialized, corn planter that's all set up for no-till. But for a real fine seeded crop, that, I don't think that there's good no-till equipment out there. Yeah, you could do maybe like squash. You could probably do on a scale like we're doing. You could go out there and poke holes, or even use that no-till transplanter, that extra spiky transplanter that we have. You could put seeds in with that. But yeah, and also our no-till grain drill, we are able to plant directly into that mulch with that.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering if you've tried, like, if you're familiar with Brian O'Hara, he has a method where he will spread mulch, whether it's leaves or straw, and then he'll broadcast small seeded crops like radishes or lettuce or spinach, just by hand sprinkling seed over it, which I've just been too nervous to try, but it's an innovative concept.
Yeah, I believe he's doing that into compost, not into like cover crop residue, but also like that kind of hand broadcasting is something that takes a lot of practice to get right. I think that might be one of the things that is kind of special to Brian.
Mhm.
It's not that other people couldn't practice that and get it right, but I've hand broadcasted seed, and it's pretty challenging.
Sure.
We actually had a spinach planting this last fall that didn't have a great stand, because I was using that Jang seeder in a heavy, the leaf compost wasn't all broken down. So we didn't have a very good stand in there, and I went and tried to hand broadcast, and I ended up putting in 10 times as much seed as I was supposed to.
Sure.
Thanks for the questions, Mark. Go ahead, Tori.
Hi, I think I just need clarification. Did you say that you're rotating between the intensive and extensive systems, or that you're just trying both for different years?
I think that eventually the answer is that we don't really have our rotation figured out. We're
Okay.
kind of like developing these systems, and one of the things that we still need to work on is the sequencing of which happens after what, which crop happens after what, and which, you want to have some stuff that goes in early so you can put in oats and peas, and then that's going to be, in an earlier crop, and that whole sequencing of the rotation we haven't figured out. But I think that when we get it figured out, one of the things that we're probably going to end up doing is maybe going into that intensive system for a year or two and then going out of it into the extensive system.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Let me just check the chat and see if there's anything that we missed here. But if anybody has any questions, go ahead.
So, do you already have plans for what you're going to be doing this spring? Have that much of an idea of what your rotation is?
Ah, yeah, that would be great. No, we haven't put our crop plan together yet. That's like top of our list right now. That's what we're working on. We do have we have a list of what we've got available for cover crops. You know, and we need to then go through and say, well, we need this many beds of this and this many beds of that, and then and then that fit that into that list of cover crops. So there is some flexibility, with early crops. We can, if we don't have enough OP sections, we can go into a rye, or so Dave is the guy that does the cover crops. He actually planted rye, barley, wheat, and triticale for winter grains. So one of the things we're going to be observing this year is, like, do some of those flower a little bit earlier than others, which is, it's interesting that information just isn't readily available. But if we want to plant something earlier into one of those overwintering cover crops, we'll mow it and then tarp it to kill that cover crop.
So, did you do intensive 2 years in a row in the same spots?
Yeah, that one section that I showed the pictures of from 2020 was then in in the intensive system again, and we planted. It was somewhat late, but we planted rye there. So it'll be growing rye. I think we'll probably let that rye grow because we really want the roots to penetrate and work the soil up a little lower down. We did see that was one of the places where there was even after 2 years there's a layer of compost, and and then kind of the regular soil underneath it, and there's a certain amount of compaction still.
So, in all of these, you're starting with land that has been previously farmed with tilling practices.
That's correct.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks.
Though we do have some sections that were, it's all been farmed, since colonization. It's all, and probably before that as well. But we do have some sections that were in pasture for a couple of years that we just tarped and planted directly into that.
Got it. Was that for the extensive?
We've got both. We have one section that we tarped pasture, and we planted oats and peas, and then planted garlic into it, directly into the oats and peas, and then mulched over the top. And we have another section that I was describing where we tarped it to kill the pasture, and then we put down leaf compost, and we subsoiled, put down leaf compost, and then tarped it again, and then that we direct seeded into carrots into it.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mabel, I saw that you actually had another question on the chat. I don't know if you need any clarification on that. With the transplanter, the question was, the transplanter makes holes, then you have to go
It did
back.
sound like, because he was talking about putting the plants in and having to put the soil around it. So, yeah,
If you're familiar with a water wheel transplanter, you
I'm
probably
not.
couldn't see it in the picture. It actually has seats on it, and it has racks so you've got all your flats of seedlings on the racks, and you've got people sitting in the seat, and they're actually sitting there and putting the plants into the holes as the thing drives along. It's
Okay.
pretty slick.
Yeah, it's not something I'm familiar with.
That's when I first started working on farms, the transplanter, I was like, wow, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen.
So basically, the machine makes holes and the people put the plants in.
Yep, the machine makes holes, but it also it drips water into the hole.
Uh-huh. And what, do you slow the machine down in order to give people time to do that extra patting the soil around?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah,
Awesome.
people who have a better tractor budget than I do have you can get tractors that have what's called a creeper gear that just drives really slowly. What we do is we put your foot on the clutch, count to 3, lift your foot off the clutch, count to 3, put your foot on the clutch. So you're kind of going along. And if your crew says you're going too fast, then you put your foot on your clutch, count to 4, lift it up, count to 2 or whatever.
That's great.
Sure saves you a lot of money.
Yeah.
Mark actually had a question from the chat here. It says, if you were to continue with the intensive system, how many crew members / acre would you estimate that you would need for labor management?
Yeah, I don't have a good short answer because we don't separate. We just have our field crew. We last year we had about 6 full-time crew members. I do know that Chuck Curry at Freedom Food Farm, he's another farmer that is doing a similar, kind of shrinking and doing some intensive and then having some that's more expansive and extensive. And he has, I think, 1.5 people on. He has about an acre market garden that he's doing that kind of intensive stuff on. And I think it's maybe 1 or maybe 2 people on that acre, and it might be an acre and a half. And in that case, it's a dedicated person who just works on that part of the system. And yeah, someone's asking for a brief explanation of the farm. There's about 10 acres of organic vegetables. We also have 200, maybe more like 300 laying hens, dozen beef cattle. We're in Amherst, Massachusetts, right in town. We have a farm store that's been open for about 3 years. It's our primary outlet. We do a CSA program through the farm store, so people, we're open 7 days a week in the farm store, and people can come in and pick up their share in the store. So. Tori, if you have any other questions about our setup here, I guess one of the things we've got our land tenure is that we're a land trust owned farm. So Dave and I have our own business, and we own our equipment. We own what's called the improvements to the property, but the land trust owns the land, and it's owned in perpetuity, and preserved in farming. So when we retire, we have the ability to kind of sell our assets, but we don't get to benefit from any like speculative land value from it.
I guess to add to that, I'm wondering if you have any maybe favorite crops or crops that you've tried in the past that you've just strayed away from because just not working for this situation.
Yeah, so we've tried to focus with our farm store. We're trying to focus on higher value per acre crops. We've found that, we can buy organic butternut squash. Other people are going to produce it, cheaper than we can. Potatoes, organic potatoes, we can buy organic potatoes cheaper than we can produce them, but we do grow new potatoes. And if we don't, grow a block of potatoes and we don't harvest all of them as new potatoes, then we'll harvest those as storage potatoes. So the kind of the more, and the winter squash also will do sometimes like the specialty winter squash, so we can have a little more interesting stuff in our store. But salad greens, tomatoes, cucumbers, summer squash, strawberries, we do about 2.5 acres of pick your own strawberries, that's one of the crops that we're not quite ready to go no-till with yet. Sorry, I thought I had plugged my computer in, but I needed to turn the power strip on also. It was about to die. Yeah. So yeah, like onions and leeks are things that are like a little less dollar per acre that we still grow, but we've done enterprise budgets and they're still relatively profitable. We've stopped growing like celeriac and parsnips, partly because we're only gonna sell like this much, and in order to have they kind of are singular crops that want their own space. So we don't have the market for one whole block of parsnips and celeriac, and so there are other things like maybe radicchio and kind of those are specialty crops that don't quite make sense for us. It makes a little more sense for us to buy those in and buy just like a case here and there. We do a lot with radishes. The salad greens are a big one. We're producing salad greens every week of the year, pretty much.
So we also focus a lot on salad greens, but I feel it's a product that is very labor intensive. We do a 3 tub wash, and that just takes forever. And it gets to a point where like I'm washing greens for an entire day and I'm going crazy. Do you do a 3 tub wash, or do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, we've mechanized our harvest. We have a TerraTech greens harvester, which is really, it makes that harvesting quite a bit faster.
We
We
just got one of those, which is a game changer.
Yeah,
So that's definitely helping.
The 3-bin, we have like pool skimmers that we scoop stuff up with to move it through the 3 bins, and then we have a modified washing machine. I feel like our biggest bottleneck in the production is the bagging. The bagging really takes a long time. We bag almost all of it, which we've gone to these biodegradable plastic bags, but those are expensive, and it's slower to bag with those also. They're not as easy to use as the real plastic.
Thank you. It seems like we have a very similar system, so yeah.
Do you need to put them in bags? It doesn't work to like bunch them.
No, they're too small for bunching. Yeah, the alternative would be putting them in bins. And we actually, when we were all CSA and we were only open a few days a week, we would put them out in bins and people would just fill up their bags themselves. But with them being, we're open 7 days a week, we've got them out in our display cooler, and they just don't hold up. If they're not bagged, they wilt very fast.
Christina, I thought you had a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I do. I've done a little bit of no-till out here. I'm in Northwest Wisconsin, and we have a problem with Canadian thistle and also with quack. And I wondered if you had any experience with that, if you encountered that, and how you handled it, if you did.
Yeah, we don't have those particular crops or those particular weeds, but we do have sections where we've got significant dock, like a curly dock, And then another spot where we've got like dandelion came in pretty extensively, and our plan is to just tarp that for a while. And in conjunction with cover crops. So we've got rye planted in those sections now. We'll mow that off for mulch and tarp it, and then cover crop it again. And I think for those perennial weeds, you really need a significant period of tarping. The thistle actually, so we do have, our hoop houses have been in no-till for much longer. And we've had a problem forever with, it's a minor problem. It doesn't get huge, but we have thistles and nettles both that kind of come in from the sides of our hoop houses. And they're very persistent. Like we'll go and we'll pull the roots out. It's a smaller space, so we can afford to take the time to pull the roots out, but they keep coming.
Jeremy, I had a question about that, to just follow up on that. The weeds that you mentioned, the curly dock and the dandelion, were these found in particular in places that there's compaction?
That's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily say that. But with that said, I think there's always a certain level of compaction in any tillage system. Yeah, the curly dock often comes in the straw when we've got strawberries. So strawberries, we've been, we till that. We till and then plant, and then we're not doing like a major tillage for 3 years. We cultivate for weed control, but we're not doing a major tillage, and that's where we often see that happening. So I think it may be, there may be compaction might be part of it, but also the fact that it's out of tillage for that period of time. So that is something we're a little worried about, is that we'll get a buildup of those perennial weeds. And at least what Brian O'Hara says is that's the way to control it, is with a long-term tarping.
And now, is that same spot that you cultivate the strawberries, do you use any amendments to like lower the pH too? Because I believe that dock does like lower pH soils.
That's interesting. I've actually been having conversations with Laura Davis about our soil tests, and that our pH needs to come down some, which I was a little surprised. We've got 6.8 to 7.1 are places where she's saying that we need to bring our pH down, and that doesn't seem that high to me. But we're also low in sulfur, so we are going to try spreading some elemental sulfur and bring the pH down. So I'll keep an eye out and see if the curly dock goes away when we do that.
I don't want to take away from people if they have questions, but I do have more questions actually. So one of the questions I had, Jeremy, was, have you considered intercropping your cover crops with cash crops and cover crops?
What we have considered, that's a little tricky to imagine. But what we have considered is maybe coming in and seeding cover crops into things like tomatoes and the kind of longer standing stuff, which we're in some ways like we're putting that mulch down, and then we're planting those, and we need weed control the whole season, and to have enough mulch is a little challenging to have weed control the whole season. So if we could, especially if it's something like tomatoes, it's going to grow up, and then we could plant cover crop underneath. Maybe after a little while, after the tomatoes are well established, we've thought about doing that. And that the no-till grain drill, one of the things that's really nice about it is, like, even if you were in a tillage system, it would help you cut down on tillage quite a bit. After the crop's out, you can just mow the crop and then plant right into it. So that's a big advantage. And even if you were established, using tillage to establish your crops, you would save quite, you'd basically save the same amount of tillage again in the fall to kill the crop. If you can just mow it and no-till plant.
Sorry, what was that piece of equipment again?
It's a no-till grain drill.
And what does it
So
do?
What's that?
What does it do?
It plants the cover crop essentially. It's the same piece of equipment that you would use if you were growing wheat or any of the small grains. But those small grains are what we're mostly what we're using for cover crops. So it's got a coulter that kind of cuts a slot through the soil, and then a funnel that drops the seed into that hole. It's pretty cool machine. That was also paid for with that acre grant. The a 6-foot unit is $20,000. So, but those grants are out there, and I encourage people to apply for them.
Wow, expensive.
Yeah. Anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, please feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any questions. This is really good information, and Jeremy is a great resource. He's one of the few people doing this stuff. I have had calls recently saying, can you get me in touch with Jeremy? Because so you guys have a unique opportunity right now. So please try to take advantage of it. Don't be shy.
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions by email afterwards also.
Awesome, thank you. Jeremy, do you mind actually dropping your email on the chat?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's also in the contact info in the program.
Perfect. We will be sending updated links, so that way any information that comes through from our presenters, any links, any additional information that will be present there, so you guys will have the opportunity to access that information there at a later date. Do you have a question here, actually? Do you grow onions? If so, when do you start your seeds?
Yeah, the onions are one of the crops that did very well. And someone's asking about emailing. Yes, of course. It did really well in that no-till system. We usually start our onion seeds March 1st. And that was something where we planted into a leaf mulch from last fall's leaves. And we'll probably do that again this year. It was actually one of the things that worked out, that part of that learning curve. We planted that thing about the hole and the plants going in. We actually did bare root onion plants. So it was particularly a particular problem to have this hole and then the plant kind of sticking in the middle of it. So we figured that out when we planted our second block of onions a couple days later. So we have a whole bunch of red onions in storage this year, but no yellow onions. We're buying in yellow onions because the first block just didn't work out at all.
I'm confused. Were you starting them indoors?
Yeah, we start the seeds in cells in the greenhouse in March 1st, and then we put them out late April, early May. And what we did this year was in order to save greenhouse space, we just had an open flat that we put a bunch of onion seeds in. So then when we were planting, we were pulling out individual seeds out of that open flat. What we've done in the past is we put them, we've used 98 cell flats, and we put like 4 seeds per cell. 3 to 6 is what we tell our crew to shoot for. And then those go in every foot. This was one of the things that we were trying to put them in, more frequently, but individuated. So with the 5 rows instead of 3 rows, and then we put them in every 6 inches, one single plant per 6 inches. It made for a lot of labor with that whole thing of pulling this stuff out, and we've got 5 rows, and there's a lot more holes, and if each hole you got to pull it took those blocks of onions took like a couple days.
Thanks. So we have just a question for clarity here from Les.
I see it there.
Yep.
So we those were beds that we put down leaves. Yeah, we they hadn't been composted. They were just covered with leaves in the spring. I believe they were oats and peas that were winter killed.
So it was a cover crop of oats and peas that dies down by itself because they do that, and then you covered them with leaves in the spring and planted into them.
Yep.
Okay. Speaking of peas, do you grow peas as an edible crop?
I do, not very successfully. That's one of the crops we plant. We put them in the pick your own garden, and our pick your own garden is kind of at the wet end of the farm, and so they always go in late, and it's just one of the crops that never seems to work out for us. We always put in a couple beds of them and then feel bad for our CSA members. We tell them this is where you go and pick your miserable peas.
So you haven't done it in sort of mass production.
What? Yeah, we don't. It might be a good candidate for, well, I don't know, for coming up through the mulch. Yeah. So there's a question in the mulch about pine needles in the leaf mulch or other debris. We accept it with pine needles. We don't accept sticks, or we tell the landscapers not to bring sticks or grass clippings. Sometimes there's a little bit of trash in it. It's not, nothing that causes us to turn away that free resource. But yeah, there's definitely some trash in it. We've found out that the landscaper's drink of choice is a Fireball because there's a lot of little Fireball nips in there.
That's too funny. That's not the first time I hear about that, Jeremy.
Yeah, gross. Like
Great. I think we may have time for one more question if anybody has any further questions. Otherwise, there is a bunch of links that we just posted onto the chat. One of them includes our evaluation for this particular workshop. And also other links into what we mentioned earlier on our vendor marketplace, the auction that was mentioned as well, and some other sessions as well that we'll be conducting later on. And I also want to take this opportunity to, first of all, thank you very much, Jeremy, for presenting. Great presentation to our translators and co-host, and for everyone who's making this possible too. So I really appreciate everyone and sharing the space with all of you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. And I do want to say, like, I don't know if I emphasize this enough, but we're still very much on our learning curve with this. And so we're happy to exchange information with people if people want to email or come by and visit or whatever. We're it's an open process, and we would love to hear from other people as well.
Thank you, Jeremy. All right, well, this is it. Thank you again, and you all have a great day. And perhaps see you next session.